You made it to the Go Commando Show with Fred Galvin. On our new mission, we contend with the naked truths of health, leadership, and overcoming adversity. Now, it's time to Go Commando.
Good morning, Commandos. Welcome to another show. We have an excellent guest this morning, a friend of mine that I've known for a couple of years now. His name is Nick Coffman, and he is not only a Marine Corps veteran who is deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom, but he is also a writer currently with SOFREP. For those of you that are not familiar with that, that's an abbreviation or an acronym for Special Operations Forces Report, and they do reporting on all the different U.S. Special Operations Forces organizations as well as foreign Special Operations Forces, and you can view all that online at sofrep.com, and Nick is here to talk to us a little bit about that. Good morning, Nick. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Great.
Yeah, I always enjoy talking to you. I usually would rather listen, but happy to do a little bit of talking today. So,
well, we are excited about you being on the show, and tell us a little bit about your background, how you were raised, and where you were raised.
Sure. So I was born and raised in southern Indiana, right across the river from Louisville, Kentucky. Had both my parents and a younger sister. And it was a pretty average childhood. Everything was, I was always taken care of and went to good schools. And, most of my childhood was spent playing with my little sister, dragging her outside to play. I didn't know the difference between the branches of service, so I just called it Army. But I kind of started that at a young age, not knowing where I would end up later. But, I had a pretty great childhood.
Great. And what were some of those other activities you did when you were younger, besides playing Army? Were you hunter or play sports at school? Or
so my parents did a really good job of exposing me to pretty much every sport available to me, whether through schools or local community programs. I did the usuals: basketball, baseball, soccer, played hockey one year. And my dad was, he was a pretty athletic guy growing up, so it was actually an enjoyable thing for me. It wasn't anything that had forced me to do. So that was something I did pretty much year round. And then hunting, I didn't really get into until I was a young teenager. I actually learned how to do most of that from my uncle on my mom's side. He didn't have any sons of his own, so when I was of age, he was more than happy to take me along and show me the ropes, and started squirrel hunting, did some deer hunting, and fell in love with it. So,
okay. You mentioned your father, and now he served in the U.S. military. Did that influence you to serve yourself, or what led you to decide to join the military?
It did. It was never anything that he talked about. He was in the Navy, or I believe he was in it for 6 years, and he never, talked to me as if he was trying to force me to go that direction. As far as I remember, what piqued my interest was his keel book that he had when he was in basic training up at Great Lakes. And as a kid, I used to, for years on a regular basis, I would just flip through it, and I had no understanding of what that was really all about, obviously, but there was just something about it that I just enjoyed. Everything from the haircuts when they arrived to some of the water training. I remember specifically a little frightening for me as a kid to see some of the stuff they did in the pool, but that was really where it started. My father and I have a great relationship, but we never really talked too much about his time in service. It's an occasional thing that we would talk about, but I always was proud of his service, and even though I didn't quite understand it, I think ultimately there was something about those few talks that I had with him and then reading his kill book that eventually led me to joining myself. So
okay, you mentioned your uncle took you hunting, and did those experiences with hunting out in the outdoors also make an interest to go? Your father served in the Navy, but being a hunter, that make you want to join the Army or the Marine Corps, or what led you to the Marines?
Well, so as far as my hunting experience, I wouldn't say that it helped me to want to join, but it did give me confidence with the weapon. Learning how to clean animals, we processed them ourselves. That gave me a good bit of confidence, so I wasn't squeamish with that kind of thing. But what ultimately led me to join, I remember in high school, the recruiters would come to school, and they would give us their little sales pitch, and I always thought the Marines looked sharp, but I never really understood, even though at that point in high school I knew the differences between the branches for the most part. I never really thought of it as something that I would actually do. I wasn't, frankly, intimidated by it. Even though I had some friends that, that was all throughout high school, they wanted to be a Marine or they wanted to do this or that. For me, I never really had that feeling. I was always a little hesitant. But what happened is after a year or so in college, I was just kind of burnt out on it, was bored, frankly. I just wanted a new challenge. And then a friend of mine, he was actually he'd been a Marine in the reserves for a few years. And I basically just saw the way he carried himself, the pride that he had, the love that he had for the Marine Corps. It was just something that ultimately drew me, and I wanted to be a part of that club. He was always a really fit guy and took care of himself and was real motivated, but he was leaps and bounds ahead of me physically, but I knew that it was something that if he could do it, I could do it, and that's what gave me the confidence to try it out. So it was basically a combination of me being burnt out on college and wanting a new challenge and wanting to be a part of what my friend had. So
okay, so you went off to college, and that's where the idea first came into your head, and then led you down to the recruiter's office. And was the Marine recruiter the first and only one you saw, or how did that go?
First and only. That was the only choice for me. I've always been, I've always had that alpha mindset where I'm not saying that I was the toughest guy in any room, the smartest guy, or anything like that, but that was always my mindset. Growing up, I got in a good bit of trouble because I wanted to be, even though I wasn't the toughest, I wanted to prove myself, and I always wanted to hold myself to that higher standard. So while I never really appreciated the Marine Corps for what it is and never really understood it until later, I knew that they would offer me that. I knew I didn't want to settle, so to speak, for anything less. So my dad wasn't, he wasn't against it necessarily, but being a Navy guy, he had that initial reaction of, really, the Marines? Are you sure you want to do that? Once he knew that I had my mind made up, he was 100% on board, and I actually credit him fully for encouraging me to go active duty. I'd initially, when I started talking to the recruiters, I wanted to, just go reserves and stay close. I was a little hesitant to start a new life, away from home. And it was actually my dad who said, if you're going to do it right. And I'll never forget that. That was kind of the defining moment for me. It's like, all right, well, I'm doing this. We'll see what happens. I signed a contract, and the rest was up to God to kind of lead and guide me there. So.
And you were not disappointed by anything you experienced when you shipped off to boot camp, or did any of your training, your initial training, were you?
I was actually a little disappointed from a physical standpoint it was definitely challenging, but overall I was expecting more of a physical challenge. At the time my run time wasn't, it was not poor, but it wasn't what it would eventually become. My pull-ups were pretty poor, but as far as a PFT, I improved over time, but just the overall physical aspect, it was relatively easy. So that was really my only disappointment. I was very well prepared mentally. My friend Matt that helped me join, he gave me plenty of tips and pointers. So I definitely went in, I think, with a little bit of an advantage over some of the other recruits. But no real disappointments there other than the physical side. I wish it was a little tougher.
And you joined in year 2000, correct?
It was actually 2007.
2007, I'm sorry, yes. So we'd been at war for, half a dozen years already, and that weighed in your mind, but you still, knowing that we were at war, you decided to join not just the military, but the Marine Corps.
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of, me being naive there. I mean, no one really knows what they're getting themselves into. You just have this idea in your head. So, I don't want to give myself too much credit because I really didn't fully understand what I was getting myself into to an extent. But yeah, it was not something that deterred me or scared me at all. It was kind of a blur. I definitely knew what I was doing, but I didn't really put too much thought into the consequences of joining during wartime.
Right. And then how long was your occupational training? And that took place in 29 Palms, California, out in the desert. Is that correct?
Correct. So I signed up for an 06XX contract, communications. And so I was assigned after MCT, after combat training, I was assigned to the MOS of 0656, which is a tactical network operator. And I heard a few different variations of this, but essentially what I understood, I had a 5-year active duty contract. The reason for that was, depending on who I talked to, one said it was because the MOS school for our job was previously a year long. When I went through, it was only 3 months. So that extra year tacked onto your contract was to make up for the time you spent in training. But then once they shortened the school, they never changed it. And then the other that I heard is because of the options that we have with that skill out in the civilian world, they basically tacked on that extra year to get their money's worth out of it. So I'm not really sure if it's a mix of the two or one or the other, but it was 3 months out in 29 Palms. I think it was like a month before our class picked up. And from there, I got orders to the 8th Marine Regiment in Camp Lejeune.
So the Marine Corps made it pretty clear that they wanted their return on the investment after you finished the school, and they knew that you definitely could, with a occupational field like that, you could be lured on the outside. So that's kind of smart for the Marine Corps to extend the normal 4-year contract out to 5 years. And let me ask, when you went to 29 Palms, California, in your occupational field, it's a kind of a schoolhouse, like you're on campus for a little bit. But were there a lot of sea stories about how it's going to be when you get into the fleet, Marine Force, or how it's going to be when you get out there and you're going to deploy it? Or they're trying to, sort of like in boot camp, talk about, you're likely to die and tell you all these horror stories? Or how was it when you were at your occupational?
Fortunate to have good instructors that were they messed with us a good bit, but one of the instructors, actually, his wife, and I can't remember if it was both of his kids or just his wife, but he had a death in the family due to an accident out in 29 Palms. So he was pretty somber throughout the whole course. He was in and out, and then the other one, he'd been busted down from sergeant to corporal for punching a corpsman, I think it was. So we had an interesting mix as far as instructors. So given the situation, they were pretty straightforward with us and didn't mess with us too much. I think most of the jokes that we had and some of the fear-mongering from instructors happened at MCT. We had one instructor that we were all sitting down. I think we were doing some, room clearing drills and different things like that. And we sat down for a little pause, and we had the whole company in some bleachers, and this instructor came up and fabricated this story about how we were going to war with Great Britain, and how somebody it was some story about how we had offended the Queen, and blah blah blah. And long story short, we're going to war with a formidable navy and military, a proper military, so we better be ready because it's gonna be ugly, I guess is his point there. So it had us going for a little bit, and some of the Marines were a little more scared than others, but he couldn't he couldn't keep the laughter in for too long, so
Right.
it wasn't too cool.
So you did eventually, obviously, complete your occupational training, and then, as you said, you went out. You had orders to the 8th Marine Regiment. That's an infantry regiment stationed out in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and they were scheduled in the regular deployment rotation to go to combat in Iraq, and that's what happened. So how was it when you checked into the 8th Marine Infantry Regiment for the Marines out in Camp Lejeune?
It was fine. I've always, my philosophy with the Marine Corps after boot camp was, okay, I did that. What's expected of me at this point? It's essentially to show up on time, stay in shape, and do what I'm told. If I simplify it, those were the 3 things that I focused on. So for me, it was a bit confusing because I didn't understand. I remember there was some confusion whenever we were told we were going to 8th Marines. I didn't know if I was going to 8th Comm Battalion or if I was going to 8th Marines, the 8th Marine Regiment. So once we found out it was an infantry unit, we were a little confused, not scared, but it was just kind of like, so, how does this work? But once we got there, it was most of the unit most of my comp platoon, I should say, had been together for some time. So it was pretty easy to step in and understand my place there. Obviously, there really wasn't any, as far as it being an infantry unit, our interactions with the grunts was always pretty good. I didn't have any issues there, I guess. It was pretty straightforward. Nothing
Right.
too exciting.
So this time, when you're checking in, it's around the beginning of 2008, correct?
It was late 2007.
Okay. And
So we found out that we were going to be deploying, I think it was by early 2008, we got word that we would be deploying in 2009, so we were going to have about a year-long workup.
okay.
And it was to be a 13-month deployment, so we knew the next couple of years was going to be busy.
Yes. And although you and I didn't meet or know each other at that time, we were both actually stationed in Camp Lejeune, the same base at the same time. And although my unit, we would deploy to Afghanistan, you deployed to Iraq. Can you talk about, while you were stationed there in Camp Lejeune with the infantry, what were some of the most memorable in a positive way, and what were some of the worst situations that you experienced when you were stationed there with the 8th Marine Regiment?
Sure. Well, overall, I have to be honest. My time in the Marines was very good. Again, going back to the primary things that I expected of myself, I made sure that I was on time. I made sure that I was fit, and I made sure to do what I was supposed to do. Just across the board. So I made my life pretty easy. I really didn't have any. There were bad days, of course, and I had some support leadership at different levels. But it was overall about as easy as it could get. And it's not even, I can't even make a joke about it being because I was a pogue or anything like that. It was just, I did what I was supposed to do. I think some of the more positive times and experiences that I had were actually with some of the infantrymen that were assigned to the headquarters support company in the operations section. The camaraderie that they had, which you know very well, obviously, but in the infantry, I learned quickly that camaraderie is a necessity and it's real. And we didn't really have that in the comm platoon too much. We had a little bit of it, but I think some of the more positive experiences I had were spending time with some of those grunts that were attached to our company, and basically just day to day, whether it was just shooting the breeze or working or going on a field op or whatever it was just spending that quality time together. It was probably one of the best things for me.
Yes. And Nick, you mentioned the word that a lot of listeners may not be familiar with. You said the word pogue. And for those who have not been in the military or in the Army or the Marines, that is another acronym, stands for person other than grunt. And so because you were in the infantry, but you did not have the infantry occupation, you were doing communication work to support infantry operations. The one of the things that a lot of people, typically criticize a pogue when they use that word, but you said that also you enjoyed your job. You didn't find recruit training to be the most challenging physical standards, but you had a lot of good friendships from those that you knew in the infantry. Did something draw you to want to try out for another occupational field that may be more challenging? Those thoughts ever want you to go for the next level?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I know there's some, from an infantry side, I know that there's the opinion that everybody wants to be infantry, and that's largely true at some point for most Marines, I would say. And I'm comfortable saying that for myself. Being in that environment, being close to that environment, there was some drawing power to it. I mean, granted, I wasn't jealous of them whenever they were just sitting around the armory for 6 hours a day, or hanging around the barracks, doing a second field day for the day. But still, I saw enough of how they operated and what their purpose was in life. I want to be a part of that. But I understood that, as young as I was in the Marine Corps, that wasn't really going to be an option. So as we were doing our workup for Iraq, I actually applied for Marine Security Guard School, MSG. And I went through the screening process, filled out my application, breezed through all of that. At the time, I was around a 283 DF tier. So physically, I was there. I was 21 at the time, so my maturity level was appropriate. And I had heard that we were going to be deploying to Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq in 2009. I knew it was going to be a bit of a slow deployment from some of the Marines that had deployed there previously. So I was like, you know what, I may not be getting action, so to speak, as a security guard, but I don't want to just go sit on some posh base for a year in Iraq. So I made it all the way through the screening process, and turns out my regimental CEO, Colonel Love, who's now, I believe, Major General, he actually denied my package because he needed me, he said, to stay with the comm platoon to support the regiment. And I know I'm fine with it now. I'm glad it worked out how it did, but basically that was my first attempt to try to get out of communications. I knew that
it's like a prison break. General Love gave you no love.
Pretty much, but he actually did me a favor in the end. I later went on to do things that I'm glad that I did, but at the time it was disappointing. I basically wanted to do something different, and I didn't want to just be another comm guy in the platoon. So it all worked out, and I'm actually grateful for him making the decision that he did. But at the time it wasn't fun. I was frustrated because I heard plenty of horror stories as far as life at a big base like Al-Assad. So
yeah, and Al-Assad. So you went over and deployed for 13 months. How was that when you went to? This is Western Iraq, the Al Anbar province. You've heard a lot of the stories about what combat operations were, but this is 2008, so things are beginning to wind down in Iraq. Was that correct?
Yeah, so I was with the advance party, so we went out. I believe we left. I remember loading the buses as everyone else in the area was counting down the seconds for the new year. I was walking on the bus there off River Road by our CP at 8th Marines, getting on the bus ready to go over to Kuwait and then Iraq. And it was a 13-month deployment. It was scheduled as that, but it ended up being just over 9 months. We retrograded and did a RIF with, I think it was the 1st and 82nd Army. So it was a shorter deployment than expected. I think, from my understanding, I was an E4 at the time whenever we left. It was just basically, it wasn't our mission at that point. As far as the Marines were concerned, things were so slow that they said, we've got to get out of here. So it was actually a pretty routine deployment from what I understand, talking to others. Again, my mindset of not being content to just sit in the comm shop and do the stuff that I thought was a bit dorky. It's just not my thing. I don't play video games in my spare time, and I don't get excited about that kind of thing. I was the one guy in my shop, as far as E4 and below, that would volunteer if they needed someone with my MOS to go anywhere in AOS. I was the guy. I was fortunate that I didn't have a lot of competition because I got fobbed out a few times. Spent some time in Waleed. TQ there's nothing special there, but I got to go to a few different South Sinjar, spent some time out there. I got to see a bit of AOS as opposed to being stuck on Al Assad, so I was fortunate in that respect.
Yes, and you'd mentioned before when you were there at Al Assad, obviously you didn't want to be idle with your time, but you began to train with some of the reconnaissance Marines that were on the base and improve your skills in the pool, and that thought came into your head as far as trying out for reconnaissance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So again, there's nothing to brag about. There's nothing special that I did because I didn't actually follow through with any of it. But I did have some interactions with a few of the recon Marines. I think initially it was first recon, and then they were replaced by I think it was Alpha or Bravo from second recon. And with both of those units, I was able to spend some time with them. I mean, they needed some comm support. I was able to help them, and just my interactions with them, I made a good enough impression to where they let me, it's not like I was hanging out with them on a day-to-day basis, but we got along well, and they invited me out to arrange with them at one point, and then a few of the guys, I would go PT with them. We would go run down to the pool at the main portion of the base, swim, run back, and after doing that a time or two, I kind of started to get the idea in my head that maybe I could do this, even though I wasn't a strong swimmer at the time. As I worked with these guys and they kind of mentored me, I kind of mentioned that this is something that I might want to do. So they explained some of the processes and some of the training that I would want to prepare myself for. And I actually started my package. I met with the monitor, career planner. I met with him and started a package for MARSOC, actually, and knew nothing about it other than, the main reason I decided to go after MARSOC as opposed to recon is because MARSOC I could go straight to. If I went recon, I would have to go back to the SOI and go that route. So to shorten the story a bit, I ended up, two reasons why I decided to kill the process for going into MARSOC, or attempting to. One, I really wasn't a strong enough swimmer, and I knew that. I worked hard and I actually got to be a pretty proficient swimmer, but I was nowhere near the level that I had to make a decision pretty quickly if I was going to do it. I knew within the time that I had, I wasn't going to be good enough. The other was just the time. At that point, I still had several years left on my contract, and I would have had to have extended that another year or two at the time, and I just wasn't prepared to make that commitment. So it was a good experience, and whenever I meet a Marine to this day, I appreciate them, and we have that bond there, but I'm certainly not impressed. It's just kind of like, okay, it's nice to meet you, Semper Fi and all that. But whenever I see a recon Marine or a MARSOC, a Raider now, those are the Marines that I have a lot of admiration and respect for, and a lot of that was because of how they carried themselves. I got to see that quite a bit, and how they treated me. They were just very professional and more than willing to help me get better. It was very selfless. They wanted me to get better, and they gave me their time, and I've always appreciated that.
Your perspective is very unique, Nick, because basically everybody in the Marine Corps, especially now with MARSOC, can try out, and if they qualify, they can go into whether it's recon, force recon, or Marine Special Operations. Some people have the, wrong assumption that, they have to be in the infantry, which you don't have to be in infantry or communications. That we have all, in those occupations which I served in, I've had literally water purification, refrigerator mechanics, all kinds of different jobs. But the person does have to pass certain qualifications as far as swimming and physical fitness, as well as, they require to extend the contract so they can get their return on investment on you. But the stuff in the pool is, as well as other land, skills that you have to demonstrate mastery of, those are not, as you saw, I'm sure, both when you're training for it and your interaction with the Recon Marines, those are not some kind of false barrier to weed out the weed. Those are actually, if you're swimming in the water, you've got all this scuba or rebreather device and you're carrying a ruck, you just have to be that confident in an open water state, in a high sea state, to be able to do that job. And but why I said your perspective is unique is a lot of people who, in a similar, they didn't even try out, but they knew that they'd have to extend in the military, or it was very challenging. They come away with this attitude that, oh, those guys, they think they're tough. It's not that tough. I remember that for me when I was in boot camp, a lot of the drill instructors were like, recon, they were glorified grunts, and that's began and lasted throughout my entire 27 years in the Marines, as a lot of people were constantly slamming recon, and you find out that most of them had the opportunity, or they all had the opportunity, but most of them didn't try out. But in your perspective, it wasn't something that, that they didn't want you, or you saw some false perceived standards. The standards are all real and necessary for the job. It's just that, you saw that there are other things that you were looking to do. And so when you returned from Iraq, you did eventually receive orders to a new duty station. How was that? Can you explain that?
Sure. I was actually in Iraq toward the end of the deployment when I met with the monitor. At that point, my intention was to get closer to home. It wasn't critical, but it was just kind of like, well, if you're giving me my pick, they were pretty generous over there because we were, currently deployed, so they pretty much gave us free reign. So I actually picked an I&I spot up in Cleveland, Ohio, with I think it was 325. So I got orders there. I get back to the shop. At that point, I was TAD to the S3. So I was with the operations section. Most of them were infantrymen. The master gunny for that section, he was an awesome Marine. I really liked him a lot. But he was the former 03 monitor. And I came back and he was like, where are you going, Coffman? So I told him, and he said, oh, you sure about that? Like, why did you pick that? And I was like, I don't know, Master Guns. You tell me. Like, what did I do? And he's like, you don't want to go there. So apparently it was just the unit's history. Apparently they had significant casualties.
They did. I was there in 05. They got beat up in Haditha really in a hit. They had a high casualties, and it really demoralized the unit very badly on that trip to Iraq that they were on.
That was what was explained to me. And so I said, okay, Master Guns. And he said, and on top of that, he said, you don't really want to be in the area that they're stationed in. It's a pretty high crime area. Life is not that great there. Having been to Cleveland since, I understand what he's talking about. But he was kind enough to take me back up there, and he knew the monitor. So he said, we're going to change this guy's orders. So where else do you want to go? And I don't know why, but I picked Norfolk, Virginia. and was going to be sent to MAR-4COM, Marine Forces Command. And after we returned in September or October of 2009 stateside, and by March of 2010, I was in Norfolk, Virginia, reporting to MAR-4COM. They're the G6 there. And, obviously looking back on it, I don't really know why I picked it. I'm glad I did, because that's where I met my wife. And, we've since had 2 kids. And it was definitely leading up to my deployment to Iraq. I was looking for action, looking for a change. I definitely didn't get it at MAR-4COM. It was the exact opposite. I mean, everything was first class, from the Navy barracks that we were living in to the actual command building. Everything was just on a much nicer level, and life was much easier. So while it wasn't what I would have picked a year or 2 prior to that, I'm glad I did it because I met my wife, so it was all worth it,
Yes. Now, for listeners that aren't familiar with the Marine Corps, Nick was describing he's stationed at a command, Marine Forces Command is what's called, MAR-4COM, which is in charge of all the Marines east of the Mississippi. So from Florida to Maine and everywhere in between, from east of the Mississippi River all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean, and as well as some of those posts overseas. So a large number, basically about half the entire Marine Corps, and it's commanded by a 3-star general. So he went from an infantry regiment all the way up to the second highest rank in the Marine Corps, and basically doing communications at a very, very high level. And so when you were there, Nick, you began to you continued on with your college education, which you had already started. Is that correct?
That's right.
And you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So there were some Marines that were taking college courses whenever we were in Iraq. A few of the sergeants that I had, they did. I'm not saying that they were actually good NCOs, but they definitely kind of sheltered themselves in the shop and would dedicate that time to doing college courses and things like that, as opposed to getting out a little bit more. But I knew it was something that I needed to take advantage of and fill some of the quiet time that I had. I mean, I could only PT so much, so there really wasn't much else to do for me. So I started taking college courses, trying to just make sure that I had courses that would meet a general degree. I didn't really have a specific area that I wanted to focus on yet. But being in a command like MAR-4COM, life was very routine, a pretty predictable schedule. So it made taking college courses easy. So for anyone that's in now or looking at joining, if you're going to be at a regiment or a battalion that's going to have a pretty high op tempo as far as pre-deployment training and deploying, I wouldn't recommend taking college courses at that point. But if you are at a command where you're stateside for an extended period of time, I would definitely take advantage of it and get a jump on your peers before you get out. So it was a smart move on my part.
That's good advice, as far as some people think that the Marine Corps owes them, but you're saying that you can do it, but you may have to do it sequentially. You wait your time in line, do your time the Marine Corps requires you to do in the infantry, deploy overseas. And you mentioned also something that was very interesting, that you had a senior enlisted that was in charge of you, the Master Gunnery Sergeant, the highest rank in the Marine Corps, but he was the one that you were working for when you were down in the infantry, and he gave you some guidance and kind of steered you in not just the right direction, but it ended up, like you said, you were married, you're able to have some of that time to go to college and really set yourself up. And those excellent examples, you also, I know from talking in the past, you had another commanding officer who was someone that you looked up to, had strong leadership skills. And can you talk a little bit about those in the Marine Corps that you've really looked up to, had strong leadership skills, both from the enlisted and officer sides?
Absolutely. So I was fortunate to serve with several good leaders at various levels, from NCOs, staff NCOs, officers. I was very fortunate. And one of the first experiences I had with a leader that I actually not just respected because I had to, but because he commanded that respect, was Brian Stan. He was a captain at the time of the H&S company for 8th Marines. And it was actually it was in 2000, I think he was there in 2007 when I showed up to the unit. And he left in 2008 before we deployed. He actually, got out of the service to pursue his career that we're familiar with now as a mixed martial artist in the UFC. And he had a humbleness about him. A lot of the officers that I had seen at that point were very high on themselves. They weren't. I mean, they were the opposite of Captain Stan. He was a humble man who you knew had purpose in everything that he did. He was very obviously very fit, and as far as a Marine, I always had that eye test where if someone looked like a bag of crap, they were going to have to work really hard to earn my respect. So he obviously had no problem with that, but my few interactions with him, he treated me very well and with that respect, whereas other officers in my command and throughout the Marine Corps would, look down on you and treat you like you were, not worthy to share the space that they were occupying and whatnot. But I really respected him for how he treated us, and he had a humbleness about how he did everything. So he was easily the first one that left a lasting impression on me.
A good leader has that humility, and it's almost a confidence, but they don't need to wear it on their sleeve. And I had on a previous deployment when I was a Force Recon Platoon commander, Brian Stan at that time was a second lieutenant in the infantry with the 3-2, and I didn't ever specifically see him, but I was serving in support of their battalion on several different named operations that we did when he was stationed out in Al-Qaim, right on the Syrian border. And there's a reason for that mindset when you've taken a lot of casualties and loss, and you realize, in the Marine Corps, as you mentioned, a lot of officers, have that big chest beating. Some of those haven't experienced those setbacks, and some of them that have, for whatever reason, they're not recalling that, we are not, as individuals or human beings, all powerful. And, some of them, it's a false ego. But Captain Stan, obviously, he went on to be a champion in the UFC, and he had those as well. You don't always win every single fight, and they're tough, and you have to prepare. And in those kind of battles on the battlefield and in the, mixed martial arts ring, you really do understand that, you can prepare as much as you want, but your opponent and adversary, they do have a say in the game, and they can inflict a lot of damage on you. So it does produce. It's good to hear that you had such great examples of leaders on the enlisted and officer side. Did you have any experiences, and you don't need to name any names, but of negative leadership qualities from those that were in charge of you while you're in the Marine Corps?
So the good ones definitely outweighed the bad. My experience with bad leadership, at the level that I was at, I was oblivious to a lot of the higher level, some of the senior officers that were, as I know now, less than perfect. And I'm glad that I didn't know at the time. But my experience with bad leaders were the ones that were just jerks for no reason. I love that part about the Marine Corps, where you're able to be hard on your Marines because they need it. Just that discipline, that tough love, or whatever it is. I'm all about that. I had a few that were just, my initial interaction to them, I would give them the proper greeting, and then they just basically insult me or make some comment about me, and I'm looking at them like, I could beat the crap out of you if I wanted to, so you're trying to compensate for something, trying to act like a tough guy, but fortunately I was able to keep my cool and just kind of let that slide, and eventually I actually had a decent working relationship with them, but I think I'll name this name, I don't mind it, but looking back on it, knowing what I know now about General Halick, whenever I was at Mar 4 Com, I started to hear some rumblings about the type of officer that he was and what his motivations were at that point in his career, but I didn't fully understand it until years later as I started working on some articles with you and others. So he's probably the only one that I wish I would have known at the time what he was really all about, because I gave him a lot of credit that wasn't deserved, in my opinion. It was at Mar 4 Com, I wrote doubles with a lot of stars, a lot of rockers. I think my section had 2 master gunnies, and we had maybe, I think it was 15 to 20 at most, E5 and below, and we had 2 E9s. So it was a bit different.
It's a lot of chiefs, not so many Indians.
Exactly. But that being said, those that were there, the lieutenant colonels, the colonels, the E9s, everyone there, they had been around the block, obviously, and there were no egos in my own section. So again, I was fortunate. That building had a lot of egos, but where I worked day in and day out was actually a very productive place to work. And I actually was mentored by a few of them. And I actually, to this day, I still appreciate everything that they've done.
So were any of those leadership personalities what led you to making the decision or reinforcing a decision that you may have already had to finish up your military service and move on to college and civilian life, or was that just on your own?
Truthfully, no. At the time, I mean, it was, looking back on it, knowing what I know now, it certainly would have affected it. But as an E5, about 5 years or 4 or 5 years of service, at the time, I really didn't have any negative experiences, and I didn't have those negative opinions of our leadership at the time. I was oblivious to it, and my decision to get out at the time was purely based on my wife and my son at the time. My daughter wasn't born yet, but I met her when I was at a non-deployable unit. I knew where I was going when my time was up there, and I knew that, frankly, my wife wasn't, I didn't want to put her through that. I didn't think she was built for it. She's a strong woman, but it's a lot on a spouse. And that was really the primary factor for me to get out, along with the steps that I had taken to line up a job waiting for me in the civilian world. I was fortunate that while there was a lot that was out of my control, God just set it up for me, but there were a lot of things that I had to proactively do to make that happen and plan and make sure that I was making a smart decision to get out. My son was only a few months at the time whenever I EAS, so I had to make sure that the decision I made was the right one. And fortunately, I wasn't making an emotional decision based on officers that were making poor decisions.
That's key and so important that you don't let a bad person or a group of bad people change your entire future with something that you love, such as military service, and you didn't. And a lot of veterans get out, and some of them end up in a kind of a rut where they don't immediately get a job and they don't, apply to school. Some do, but a lot of them end up taking a little bit of a break and easing into things, and it really puts them behind the power curve. But your example, you went straight in, not just tackling employment, but really moving and advancing far with getting a bachelor's and eventually a master's degree. What drove you to, immediately go out and set those goals and accomplish them in with employment and in your academic pursuits?
Well, ultimately, I would have to sum it up by saying providing for my family and making sure that I took every opportunity I had to better their lives. That was really my driving factor. My wife was, it also takes a supportive wife to allow you to take that time that is required. You know very well how much time and effort goes into that level of education. So I definitely needed that support, and I had it. So I knew that was a green light for me to continue with it. And then I know there are a lot of service members and veterans that join for benefits. I definitely wasn't one of them. But once I was made aware what was available to me with the GI Bill and some of the other programs out there, it makes no sense not to take advantage of them if you are in a field where it would benefit you, or if you want to pursue a field where it's going to benefit you. So frankly, it was just, again, it was kind of a no-brainer. I mean, it was not much of a decision. It was just what I had to do.
Yes, I agree. And Nick, you're like the leaders you mentioned with Captain Brian Stan. I mean, you're being very humble about yourself, but I want to talk to the listeners about so you served your country, for 5 years. While at the last duty station, you met your wife, you had a child, you're going to college, and you jumped straight in after the Marine Corps, straight into a civilian job, which we're not going to get into too deeply, but at the same time you were a full-time student, and then what led you to, with all that going on, and then you had a second child, you took on this extra interest of being a writer at the SOFREP. What led you to really loading up the plate that heavily?
Well, as far as the SOFREP opportunity, I had just finished up school, and I was used to having that additional work in my life. I knew that I had the capacity to take something else on, and I wasn't looking for it. I was a subscriber to SOFREP, big fan of the site. I loved their perspective from the various writers that they had. And one day I saw an article that they released about essentially a tryout for a writing spot. So at that point, I had been putting my thoughts down into the form of a book about my life and my time in service, from the perspective that there's plenty of books about tankers or recon guys from our side. There's plenty of books out there, but not that there's anything glorious or extraordinary about it. But my life, as far as non-infantry, is something that's not really talked about. So I wanted to, just to get the story out there. But then, if anything, just to have something for my kids to read one day. I started putting a book together, and I used a few of the stories from that book as my submissions for the articles in the SOFREP tryout. And the way it worked is, out of everyone that submitted, they narrowed it down to however many candidates, and then they would take our articles and post them essentially at the same time. And then after a 2 to 3 day period, the top 3 articles, we were competing against each other. Those that had the highest views on their articles got the job. So there was a job for a contributing editor, and then there was a job for a managing editor. I was applying for the contributing editor, and I beat the second place guy out by a few thousand views on my articles.
Wow.
So I went from being on the other side of the curtain, this is a fan and a supporter of the site, to communicating with Brandon Webb and Jack Murphy and Reb and Ebels with those guys. And from day one, they were, I was just very impressed with how they were not micromanagers, but they were very concerned and supportive about making sure that I had everything that I needed to be successful. And it was just kind of a bizarre thing that I didn't expect. I went from being a fan to a paid writer for a major news outlet. And it's been almost 2 years now since I've done that, since I started that.
Yes.
And it's just been a great opportunity. I've been able to talk to a lot of great people, yourself included, gain some friendships for life, and yourself included, out of this. And I actually met or got reacquainted with some folks that I had known over the years, one of them being our friend Steve Morgan, Colonel Morgan.
Yes.
So
He's a jury member during our trial, and that's actually how we all three connected. Was retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel Steve Morgan. He was a member of SOFREP, and he basically said, "Hey, what do you think about contacting a SOFREP about the story that the Marine Raiders that we deployed with in 2007, our company that I commanded, was falsely accused of war crime, and for 8 years it had been misrepresented in the media, saying that basically it was a mass murder." And so Steve Morgan and myself, both after we retired, set out to set the record straight, and that's how both Lieutenant Colonel Morgan and myself contacted you. And I remember I was retired and running my business, and we were actually on an MBA trip over in China, and that's where you and I were starting to correspond. And I was sending you a ton of the courtroom transcripts, and you're writing this very in-depth 5-part story, which I would highly recommend any of the listeners or viewers go to SOFREP, SOFREP, and look up Nick Coffman's articles, and you can not just see the type of writing that he does, but you can actually read the in-depth case of how the two of us connected with his reporting on the MARSOC 7.
You can search for MARSOC 7 or Fox Company on SOFREP, and you'll find the whole series.
Yes, MARSOC 7 or SOFREP or Fox Company, and type in Nick Coffman, and it should be able to pop up. So Nick, you had actually, like I mentioned before, you were stationed in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, when this went on. The company that I commanded, we got sent back and accused of war crimes. And during your time there in North Carolina, or when you're overseas, you heard a little bit about this. And at that time, all the reporting and the rumor was, very negative. Everything in the newspaper saying that we had basically killed 19 and wounded 50. But then in 2016, when you started at SOFREP, and we actually got connected, and you were able to read all the courtroom documents, the sworn testimony. What was kind of the before and after in your experience, if you can explain that?
Sure. So when I was in, let's just start in 2008, when I was a young junior Marine at Camp Lejeune. The only thing that I had heard, other than maybe seeing a little piece in the Marine Corps Times or something in the PX, was just the brief mention of some MARSOC dudes shot up some village or something like that. That's about the gist of it. There was no discussion. There was no additional information. It was that general statement, and you just took it for what it was worth. So it wasn't until years later, obviously, when I was stationed at Mar 4 Com. Colonel Morgan was there working as a civilian in the G2, and I had a few interactions with him. But it wasn't until we all linked up for this article that I started to understand what really took place. And I remember it was funny, again, anytime you're new to something, there's always a bit of, being naive to what really happened. But I remember you kind of saying, like, there's a lot of information here, Nick. I think my opinion was that we could probably do an article in a short amount of time to get the story out there, indicating like maybe a 1,000 or 2 words or something like that, and we'll be able to get this knocked out. And you're like, I don't think you understand, Nick. There's a lot here. And so as you started to provide the documents that were previously classified, and then you and Colonel Morgan explaining things to me, that's when I started to understand just how big this was and how wrong it was that for so long the perception that you all had gotten away with murder was just it blew my mind. I remember the first time that I mentioned, Jack and Brandon have always been very supportive of, if you have something you want to write about, we're not going to censor you. We're not going to say don't publish that. They have always encouraged their writers to get the truth out there. Doesn't matter if it's controversial or somebody's going to get upset with you. We'll deal with it if it comes up. But I remember telling Jack about, hey, I've got this story that I'm working on, and what do you think? And he was like, oh, is that one of those MARSOC guys shot up some village in Afghanistan? And I was like, you heard that too, huh? So that was when I knew, when he made that comment, that's when I knew that I needed to really devote as much time and energy as I could into getting this right, because it wasn't just a rumor that I heard as an E3 years ago. It was something that a decorated Ranger in Green Beret and a very educated person, he thought the same thing, so I knew that it wasn't right.
That's a key point, Nick, because as you mentioned, you checked into Camp Lejeune the very end of 2007, and what the word on the street was while you were there throughout the time you're in Camp Lejeune for several years, and our trial was in January 2008. So after January, the information was known to the court, and it was soon after reported. But what the word on the street was to the average Marine in Camp Lejeune is what you just stated. That these Marines killed all these people in this village, and then you mentioned, years later when you got hired in 2016. So you fast forward from 2002, 2007 and 8. Then you go 8 years later, and you have your boss at SOFREP, who decorated Army Special Operator, and the word he not just heard, but still perceived to be the truth was, yeah, these Marines from MARSOC went over to Afghanistan and just killed all these civilians. And that was 8 years after the trial had ended and adjudicated, and that's kind of where we're still at with a lot of this is, people still believe, even though SOFREP has written it and many other people have written it, people at MARSOC, and I've talked to, a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School who deployed on ship, the first half of the deployment before we got to Afghanistan, as well as there's another professor, former, a guy who was served in the Marine Corps. He's at the Army's War College. These are people in high places in the military. And then as you've reported, there's people in Amnesty International, International Bar Association, the mainstream media with the New York Times and Washington Post who have all written that basically, 7-8 years afterwards, Washington Post and New York Times, a writer at the New York Times wrote a book, slandering us 7 years after the fact. And it's widely still believed and perpetuated by the mainstream that, we killed civilians, and that's why we're still trying to get this corrected through House Resolution 21 that Congressman Jones is sponsored and fighting for. So let me go back, Nick, to a question that you mentioned. Both your bosses at SOFREP, Brandon and Jack, they have never prohibited or censured you from writing anything. And right now in the mainstream media, there's so much bias. You can see it. There's so much stuff that's filtered, whether you see something that's on the left or right. I mean, it's completely presenting one side of the story instead of the 5 W's, and it's very sensationalized. And do you think a lot of the American news consumers are seeking more entertainment than news? Or what's your thoughts on,
I think that they're seeking whatever outlet is going to tell them what they want to hear. Let's just use President Trump as an example. If they support President Trump, they want to meet a news outlet that's going to build him up and tell their side of the story. And then on the opposite side, they can't stand President Trump, they want to go to an outlet that bashes them, which those are quite easy to find. But I think that's it. They want to find the narrative that they want to hear. And what I love about SOFREP and what I appreciate about them, us, is we have writers that have differing opinions on any matter that you could throw out there, whether it's politics or foreign policy or whatever you have. We have a broad spectrum of opinions and experience. It's very apolitical at the site. I mean, there are guys that, depending on the article you read, you might think that they, while we don't have anyone that's openly supportive of Hillary Clinton, essentially you could get confused at different times because you're like, I thought you were leaning this direction, but you're writing this. Like, why would you do that? Like, I thought you supported this guy or this person or this cause. When the reality is they're just telling it like it is. That they don't stick the political narrative, and our bosses, Brandon and Jack, don't hold us to that. That's just not how we work. So it's refreshing to work in that type of environment, and then as a reader, hopefully it's refreshing for people to be able to go there and know that they're not just going to get some set narrative for one side.
Yeah, that is refreshing that a source in the news can report news versus opinion. And over the years, I've talked to several, reporters and journalists, and they definitely have a very strong opinion one way or another. And, from what's happened in my case, some people may say, most people in the military, especially Marines, are all conservative. And, if you've had that organization, which I just mentioned, is pretty much all conservative, if you've had that machine turn on you and go after you, you may have, like in my case, a mindset that, both sides, still need to, be open-minded, and both sides need to play by the rules. And we don't have that so much anymore. We have people, breaking rules and, putting a lot of bias and filter in there to, as you said, present the side of the story that, people want to hear instead of what the, plain truth is. A couple other final questions, Nick, is there been a time in your either military or post-military career that, has been a very difficult challenge that you struggled with and overcame that you can talk about?
Yeah. Again, when I was in, I don't want to oversimplify things, but at the E3 to E5 level, there's a lot of responsibility that can be placed on you, and rightfully so, and it's widely done. But for the most part, you're responsible for such a small piece of the Marine Corps. While there's challenges to that, and different environments, different variables will change that. But for the most part, it's pretty simple. So as far as what I was responsible for, I never really had anything that was some monumental challenge that I had to get through. It was just another day, a minor road bump or an issue to work through, but I never had anything that was that significant. Now, once I got out, there had been some challenges. I think, again, it's related to providing for my family. There have been times where, early on we went from having some of the benefits that we did in the Marine Corps to having to pay, out of pocket for so much. So that adjustment, I think, was a big surprise to us. We didn't really factor that in whenever we planned for getting out. I think that for my family specifically, I wish we had better care and guidance for transitioning out from a financial aspect. My wife and I are blessed to have great jobs, and we're able to provide and have nice things, but it was stressful for years as we transitioned. I don't think that the Marine Corps, whenever I went through SEPs and TAPs, did a good job of tailoring their advice and their training to family. I think it was very focused on the individual, specifically, a young 20-something-year-old corporal or whatever. There wasn't a lot of guidance for a family. So because of that, I think we struggled for the first few years as we transitioned out. But again, I'm grateful that my situation was relatively easy. I know a lot of Marines and other veterans, they get out and have true hurdles to overcome. And for me, I was just it was a minor speed bump that we had to work through for a few years financially, but I've been very blessed to have that be it.
Yes, and that's a key point that you bring up, Nick, that as we've talked about your military background, the Marine Corps spent 3/4 of a year just getting you a basically trained Marine to check into your unit to do your job for nearly 9 months with all the different initial schools. And then when a service member leaves, in the case of the Marines, you attend call it a TAP class that's 5 days in a classroom, basically explaining the need, which is good, but it may not be the full measure that 5 days of showing a guy how to write a resume and apply for jobs doesn't always lead them in the full right direction of some of the other things that may be happening to them, such as, like you mentioned in your case, getting married and balancing that with a family, not just a wife. And things don't always go right when you leave the Marine Corps and move across the country. And then your educational benefits, and like in your case, you didn't just go for the bachelor's, you made that investment to go for a master's beyond that. And the GI Bill pays for 36 months of educational benefits. So like you mentioned, it's an investment that some of those educational benefits, they can go a long way, but they don't completely cover it. But I do really encourage people, by your example, that here you continue to mention, you want to provide for your family, not just with a job, but future employment opportunity that can continue to get you promoted and provide the best possible standard for your family. And how did you particularly develop that mindset, and what encouraged you to continue on taking those risks? You're not risking your life, but it's financial risk, extra stress on the family. What were your driving forces during all that?
I had a lot of positive influences and folks to look up to. My parents, my grandparents, different families that I grew up with in church and things like that. That I saw the example. It was more of a no-brainer again for me that I didn't have to put a lot of thought into making this leap. I've always known that I need to accept responsibility for my own actions. And while there are a lot of variables that are out of your control, what you can control, you have to take action and do what's right. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify things for me, but that's been my mindset: is I need to do what's right, and I can control this. I can't control these, so I'm not going to worry about these other factors. But if I can make this decision, and I can do like a pro and con list essentially to see if the pros outweigh the cons, and if they do, it's a yes, I'm moving forward with it. So basically, I just had a positive example from family and friends, and I've seen the hard work that they've put in and the sacrifices that they've made, and the decisions that I had to make were pretty small in comparison. So it was a pretty easy decision.
Great, Nick. And is there any other things that you want to highlight on in regards to your life story that we're talking about today?
No, again, I would encourage anyone watching or listening to this to take a look at SOFREP.com. Do a search for my name, Nick Coffman, or specifically Fox Company, MARSOC 7, or just type in the word. If you type in the word recon or MARSOC, there's a good chance that I've had my fingerprints on it over the last few years on the site. but I would definitely encourage you all to educate yourselves on some of the subjects that I've written about. And if anyone ever wants to get in touch with me, I'm on social media. You can find me on Twitter at KoffmanNR. And I'm always happy to answer questions or point you in the right direction if I don't have the answer. So, and I do want to say too, Fred, again, I want our listeners to understand how much I appreciate you and several others that I've worked with on our articles, and you've always been very professional, very honest, and you put in a lot of hard work. You spent just as much time as I have preparing, reading through documents, providing materials for me to work with, and I really appreciate all the hard work that you did to help me be successful.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. I'm very humbled by that. And one other thing we touched on, but I wanted to highlight as well, is Nick mentioned he wrote a book. It's called The Other Marines, and it's by himself, Nick Coffman. And I found a copy online while we were preparing. It's selling on Amazon. The copy that I saw, the one copy was selling for $997. So Nick is
the brief story behind that is the publisher has since gone out of business. So
you can get the book though.
So if you want to, I don't think anyone's going to go near that price, but what you can do is you can reach out to me on social media. Again, I gave my Twitter handle. You can reach out to me, and I'll be happy to provide you with a digital copy. It's the book is about my time in service, and then a friend of mine, he was an EOD technician. He has a really great story. I don't want to downplay mine, but I really think highly of this guy. So if you're interested, just reach out to me, and I'll be happy to provide it.
Thank you very much again for sharing your inspiring story, Nick. It's a great testimony. Somebody that is from Mid-America, joined and served our nation during a time of war, got out and began a family and a successful career. And you've had many great accomplishments, both educationally and as a writer at SOFREP. So thank you very much again.
Same to you, Fred. Thank you.
To all my fellow grunts out there who in your youth felt it was your duty to protect us, I salute you. And thanks to the listeners of the Go Commando Show who labor on the farm, who are sweating on the construction site, putting forth your very best at the office, you are making a difference. Support the Go Commando Show in our pursuit of bringing you the highest quality professionals. Infiltrate the website at GoCommandoShow.com, where you can view all of the podcasts and arm your team with incredible deals on health supplements, commando clothing, and equipment. Every time that you get a good deal, it supports the show. What deals? When you purchase anything from the website, Amazon, healthcare supplements, you're covering our six. And to the ladies on the team, when you outfit yourself in the super sexy threads from Naked Zebra, and yes, I'm talking about in fuego, you are firing the sniper shot for our commandos. How else can you support? It's simple. You smash the follow and subscribe buttons on our social media. That is how you support us bringing great guests to talk about serious subjects, not the mainstream media's fake news. So thank you, and until our next show, stay in the attack and go Commando.